Hello and welcome everybody. I am Susanne Bødker and I'm Professor of Computer Science at Aarhus University in Denmark, and this is my ACM CHI Lifetime Achievement Award talk for 2024. It's entitled Through the Interface and What Followed, and I'll explain some of that later. First of all, I want to say what is the overall, I would say, trajectory of my research throughout my career. And basically, it's about understanding how people use technology and how people adapt and appropriate technology. So why is use as it is? How can it come to be? What are the decision processes behind it? How was technology designed? What was it intended for? How could alternatives be provided? Processes and products, basically. So in my own career, I studied at Aarhus University, so you can say I was early on trained and drilled with the idea that participation when it comes to designing and using technology is important. Back in the days, we had the Scandinavian tradition of systems development. Then I went at a research day at Xerox PARC in 1982. And at that time, I also learned that technology is something that you can mold and work with and change. So when I came back to Aarhus, I worked with the Utopia project that had already started before I went. So we worked a lot on how skilled users, in this case typographers, could appropriate technology, take in technology, how newspaper production would change, and so on. So in those early years, we had quite a lot of focus on empowerment and mutual learning. So empowerment, I think, is about how people can be empowered not only as individuals, but also as groups, be it their community, their organizational units, or whatever. So how can people take charge of their own use of technology? How can they influence how technology is taken on and developed and so on? So in this perspective, people are resourceful experts in their own joint practices. And when we talk about this, it's not only about how the practices are currently established, it's also about how they were, but surely also how they possibly will be established in the future. So I'm not talking, when I talk about practice, it's not a static thing, it's also a possibility of future practices. And mutual learning is then the important way in which users and designers, developers work together in processes to design, develop, and appropriate technology. So basically, for mutual learning, designers learn from users and vice versa. And one of the important things is that both groups are experts regarding their own practices. So learning is profoundly needed between those two groups for the quality of the solutions that are provided. And this is true, I would say, both for specific projects, but also for future projects and end-user development. So mutual learning is important here. In my own early work, I would say that prototyping, and I think for reasons of empowerment and of mutual learning, prototyping was very important. So in the Utopia project, we worked a lot to find out how we could communicate to some of these typographers who are actually in this picture, what future technologies would be like. And we found out that starting with their practices and exploring what we called hands-on experience through prototyping was important. And again, on the side of this, from PARC, I had this understanding that technology is actually malleable and can be worked with, and that was also then included into the thinking about prototyping. So I would say we worked a lot with cooperative prototyping as a process, but we also worked with what was called mock-ups, or is called mock-ups, that are not necessarily running prototypes, but that are easy for people to also engage with and suggest solutions for. And I would also say that it was important already at that time to not only think about building one solution, but actually building alternatives and showing and demonstrating to people that there are alternatives. The result of this was my PhD thesis that was published as a book. It was called Through the Interface, and the research that was demonstrated there took its starting point in all these projects that I talked about here. And then I went on to work with activity theoretical basis for human-computer interaction. And when we talk about through the interface, it's because the idea was that the interface is not a flat and static surface, but that actually people engage with each other and with materials through the interface. Some of the central tenets, I would say, of activity theoretical HCI as I worked with it and developed it over the years is the role of mediation. So mediation is, as I was saying, the idea that a user interface or technology is in a way sitting between the human being and his or her environments, his or her materials, his or her outcomes that he or she is working in with. And so it's a mediation between the human being and the materials that one is working with, but also a mediation between human beings, among human beings. So when I stand here and talk to you, this is a mediated activity. I'm using some sort of projection technology to show my slides. There are some cameras in the background. They are all part of the mediation of this situation that allows this talk to eventually be spread throughout the world somehow. So we talk about different forms of mediation, and I've sort of hinted at those already. So there are tools. Tools are the ones that we typically use to build tangible outcomes with some materials. There are languages, which is what we use to communicate with each other. There are also means of dividing work. So for instance, I would say the way this room is set up is a mean of dividing the work between me and you and the audience out there somehow. Because I'm standing here, you're sitting there, there's somebody later watching a video. It's all a way of saying that I'm giving the talk, you guys are doing something else. Right? Mediation in the activity theoretical sense is also a matter of not only how we do it, how we handle things, how our affordances and physical proportions. It's also a matter of why technology exists the way it is, why it has been built, what is the purpose of it, and what are we actually doing together in the specific activity that we're working with. Finally, I think it's important to say that with the thinking of mediation in the activity theoretical basis, and I think actually mainly also something that was very important in the early years, is this idea that the technology, when we use it because of this mediation, is transparent in a way that we don't necessarily notice it. We focus on the materials we work with, I focus on you guys, and so on. And it's only in situations of breakdown where the technology stops somehow that we see it, that we see the technology, and it becomes a center of focus of our attention. So those are the basic ways in which mediation has been important throughout my work, but going back in time. The second thing is the idea of that goes together with mediation, of thinking of artifacts as something that are made by humans for humans. And with that, and again, I would say, what that means is we made artifacts to make them fit the human handling, but they also have motive and intentions. So it's interesting that in the activity theoretical thinking, activity is crystallized into artifacts in basically two ways. There are externalizations of operations in early artifacts, meaning that somehow they are based on and show how we done things before without the technology, but they also represent certain modes of acting in the given activity. Victor Capitolini talked about artifacts as being functional organs that become part of human beings, and hence we are moving the boundaries outwards. This is not something that activity theory invented. Polanyi, for instance, also talked about this blind man and the stick walking, and where the stick becomes the extension of the human body. But I think those are all parts of what mediation is, what artifacts are. Now, it obviously does not stop there, and when I hinted in the title to this idea of and what followed, I think when you look at my publications, in particular my citations, the idea of these waves in human-computer interaction thinking and theory have been very important. Coincidentally, I mean, I got invited to give a keynote at Nordic High in 2006, and so I struggled quite a lot with how I should present to the world what I thought was the status of human-computer interaction at the time. And that led to this thinking of first, second, and third wave human-computer interaction. I would say it also, I mean, it was well received, but I think it also talked about the shift of focus from how human-computer interaction in the early years was primarily modeling humans as the starting point for design to the focus on mediation. Also, it pointed to the difference between and the move from understanding users in the laboratory to understanding real use activities, which was also important. And then also the shift from only understanding individual cognition to understanding collective practices. So I'm often asked to follow up on this idea of waves, and I'm actually, in a way, not so sure that there's a fourth or a fifth wave, and I'm not terribly interested in the question, really, but surely sort of positioning the whole situation at the time made a lot of sense to me. I've been continuing to work with activity theoretical HI over the years, and with Clemens Klockmose in particular, I went on to work with the understanding of the relationship between the human beings and the computer through this thing that we ended up calling the human artifact model. The human artifact model embraces, in a way, what I already talked about for activity theory, that there are the levels of why, what, and how a technology is used by a human being in a particular situation. And we could sort of map that out to talk about the motivational aspect, the motivational orientation of the human user, the instrumental aspects and the goals of the human user at the next level, and then the whole business of handling technology, which is in a way both talking about how the human being has learned particular ways of doing things, also how we are and what we can do when we sit on a chair and stuff like that, but also that the artifact side reflects both of those. What I think became in a way quite interesting once we first developed the human artifact model is this thing that we could start to analyze, in a way, the human being at the center of a number of artifacts that the person is using either in a situation or over time, and at the same time also taking a starting point in a particular artifact and think about how that artifact is and can be and even is intended to be used by particular users in particular situations. So the human artifact model sort of also made us take a next step into this idea that we need to understand multiplicities, multiple artifacts, not necessarily at the same time, sometimes over time, but also that hence this idea that we have this thing that we choose to call artifact ecologies. There are other people calling it other things, but that artifact ecologies are in a way the technologies that we are surrounded by, not necessarily again as individual humans, but also as groups and communities. I'll get back to that just a little bit. But also with Peter Bødker, actually quite early on, I studied how in actual situations people were chaining and juxtaposing and substituting technologies between each other in real use situations, such as a ship bridge or wastewater plant that we have here. So we have quite a number of studies of how artifact ecologies and multiplicities are actually used and how that happens. Development and learning, I think, are equally important. So development, as I'm saying, is not, it's not static what we can do as human beings and the technologies we have. So it's quite important to understand how we learn as human beings, both as individuals and communities, how we appropriate technology in this, how we develop shared practices around certain technologies. With Bannon and Capitolini, we can even say that some of this development comes from the outside, other parts come from the inside, and both of those two are relevant to understand. And hence, I also think that if we take the move from from understanding how development happens with technologies, how people learn and how people appropriate technologies, we also need to think about design methods that focus on change processes and not just on static situations. Some of this business of artifact ecology and so on has also developed into a long interest in how people share stuff through technology. So this might be, in one case that I have here, how people share their observations about natural phenomena through a platform, and how there are different actually challenges and tensions between different users of these platforms. How people are surrounded in a particular community with a large number of technologies that are used in different ways and by different people at different times, and also actually what we do in the small, say if we're sitting together in a group and writing together. So we focus quite a bit on the materials that we collaborate through, and also I would say in a lot of this work we actually also focus on how the material is in a way not only material but actually how we also communicate through these materials, be it a Google Doc or Henrik's nice visualization up here of how people have been accessing different parts of a document at different times. Second to last thing I want to just mention here is that we also took the idea of artifact ecologies to specifically address how communities engage with what we then call community artifact ecologies, which are the particular constellations of artifacts that a community owns, has access to, or uses in its activity. From there, we realized that some of these communities actually held together not only buy these sort of material things. So we wrote a really interesting paper, I would say, where we developed the idea of collective artifact ecologies based on the idea that there are collectives that are also held together in ways where the identity is reflected in and reflecting the practices, the wider society, their development, their joint goals, and also the interpersonal relationships between people in the collective. The last thing I want to talk about is that, going back again to this idea that we are also building technologies. And quite a bit of my work over the past years has been thinking about how theory and empirical cases and design go together. And I wrote a paper with Wendy Mackay and Michel Baudin-Lafont, where we talked about generativity, where we talked about how we can activate the HCI theories that we have together with prototypes, together with empirical cases, to do design that is both, in a sense, where we activate the theories both analytically, critically, and constructively. So I think this is really, in a way, a tour de force of the work I've done over the past many years. I started to think that, of course, I have never been in this alone. So in a way, you could say the team has been terribly important to me. And whatever that is also very sort of open-ended, I would say. In a way, you can say listing your former PhD students and postdocs is kind of the easy part. There are also a number of people who I've had ongoing collaborations with over many years and who I've published with several times over the years. And those are all easy to list. I would also say that the whole HCI community at Aarhus University has been important over the years. I think we've all benefited from the HCI at Aarhus University as an interesting place. So we've always had nice visitors and also actually good funding for guests. And I think that's important. And if you want to take something home about building up a group and a community, maybe that is it. But of course, it doesn't stop here. I had Mette, who is a secretary in the department, take from Google Scholar all the people I've published with over the years. I took some names out because they're not all real co-authors, but this is a long list, right? And this is at least some of them. It's always been a joy to work with all of them. I just want to say we've also in the community in Aarhus over the years had this conference every 10 years. It started before my time in 1975, but we've had these critical computing, computers and democracy conferences. In 2025, we are working to have yet another one. It's about computing and or with whatever crisis you can fill in the X. And finally, I want to say that there are sources for learning more about me and my career. There's an oral history section that the ACM actually did with me. It can be found at least through my Google Scholar profile. And also Geraldine Fitzpatrick, not too long ago, did a very interesting podcast with me about career and culture and choices. So thank you very much for listening. This is it.